Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. It's really great to be joining you on yet another Thursday lunchtime. A warm welcome to our returning viewers, and especially a warm welcome to those of you who may be joining us for the very first time. Please do let us know where you are watching us from, and do let us know if this is your first time joining us. So as is the tradition with our lectures, it will be starting about 10 minutes, so at about 1 o'clock we'll get underway with our lecture. But for these first 10 minutes, we like to do what we call Church of the Week. So I'm going to pass you over to our Chief Executive, Peter Reyes, who's going to tell you about the church we've chosen this week.
Thank you, George. Well, it's interesting, but the church we've chosen this week is actually Holy Trinity Church, Wentworth in South Yorkshire. Now, I would normally give you a sort of potted history with some slides, but George, I understand that you actually were there yesterday or the day before. And so you actually got to go out on site, for which I am very jealous because it's been a long time since I've been out on site, I could tell you. So I think you're probably better placed to tell us all about Church of the Week, Holy Trinity, Wentworth.
Thanks, Peter. So yeah, early this week, I've been very lucky in that I was able to get out to some wonderful, wonderful CCT churches. And I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully you can all see this coming through. And this is a church that we're going to talk about today. So this is Holy Trinity, Wentworth in South Yorkshire. And before I go on, we just want to say a big thank you to our sponsors, Ecclesiastical Insurance, for sponsoring the Church of the Week in these lunchtime lectures. We really do. We're really grateful for the support by them sponsoring us. But I was able to get to a few other churches before I got to Holy Trinity Wentworth. So I'm going to give you a quick whistle-top tour at some of the churches I've been to this week. So the first church I managed to visit was St. Peter's, Ticoncote. And I was last there when it came into our care on December the 3rd, 2019, and we're shortly going to be starting vesting repairs at this church. It was great to get there, but as you can see, the gem of this church is this wonderful, wonderful Norman arch. After Ticoncote, I was able to go up to Nottinghamshire to St. Peter's, Gampston. Now, this again is a recent vesting with us, and this church has come to the end of its vesting repairs. So all the repairs to the exterior have now been completed. We couldn't go inside the church because they're still continuing. It's a working site where they're doing a lot of electrical work and doing repairs. But this was a huge, huge project, and the church is just looking fantastic now that those repairs have taken place.
Is that a photo from yesterday, George?
That's from 2 days ago. Yeah, we have great weather.
It's looking amazing. The last time I was there, it was looking pretty sorry for itself. So it looks fantastic. Brilliant.
And then after that, I was able to get to Kirksandall. Now, Peter, you'll remember Kirksandall because the last time I was there was with you on the Great Steeplechase. And it's amazing because now, last time when we were there, Peter, none of the houses which you can see there were there. And it's a brand new estate that's been built around our church. And it's great to see that this historic church is at the heart of a new community that's just been built. And I know, talking to the volunteers there, they cannot wait to start putting on events at this church, making links with the community and opening the church doors.
Well, it just goes to show if you hang around as a church long enough, you've lost your community. It can sometimes come back again, doesn't it? There were no churches when we were there. Was it 3 years ago, I suppose, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was, and that was part of our 50th anniversary celebrations. And then I suppose the last church I was able to get to was our very first church that was vested in us, which was really special. And this St. Peter's, Edlington. It has a wonderful, wonderful Norman archway there. It also has a great doorway into the church with beautifully carved bird beaks. But the church I wanted to tell everyone about today is this church, and this is Holy Trinity Wentworth in South Yorkshire. And it's a corker of a church. It looks quite ruinous here, and it's nothing to do with us. That came to us in this condition, and you'll see why in a moment. But this church has 12th century origins. It's a very, very historic church. It was an estate church, so it served the family of the Fitzwilliams. It's got a fantastically large churchyard with some great monuments, and you'll see some of them very shortly. But in the 1800s, the Fitzwilliams, who had traditionally used the old church as their mausoleum, there's a lot of beautiful monuments inside, decided they wanted a grander church. So they built this, and it is literally opposite the church. This is New Holy Trinity, Wentworth. It was designed by Pearson, and Pearson, for those of you who know, built Truro Cathedral and Brisbane Cathedral in Australia. And this church is on a cathedral scale. And it was nice to go in, and they were about to say morning prayer. And the volunteers and members of the congregation, they were sort of asking questions. When are we opening? They can't wait to get back to the old church. But the reason why they, as I said, the new church was built was because of the Fitzwilliams. Now, the Fitzwilliams used the old church as their mausoleum. And if you go into the North Aisle, there's these steps that go down, and you go to the end of a very long tunnel. And at that end of the tunnel is this crypt tomb or crypt chamber. And there's 12 burials there. But as you can see, there's a lot of empty slots there. And this was built in 1824. And what happened was, when they built the new church, they decided actually they didn't want to put the burials here anymore. They wanted to put them in the new church and in the new churchyard, so that the burials memorials would be a lot more publicly visible, so that they could show off a bit more. But this is a unique, and I'll say we don't have any kind of mausoleum quite on this scale. And it was quite nerve-wracking going down those steps at the end of a long tunnel, seeing this wonderful chamber at the end. But there's some great monuments at this church. And we've got some fantastic medieval alabaster carvings inside the church. But I wanted to draw everyone's attention quickly to this monument outside the doorway into the church. Now, this is to Hannah Jennett. Now, Hannah was the housekeeper to the Fitzwilliams in life. And when she died, they put her right by the doorway to the church, so that and they positioned her tombstone at an angle, so that when the Fitzwilliams walked into church, they could look on her gravestone and she could look out at them. So it's quite nice that in life she served them, but in death as well, there was that relationship she wanted to have with the family who would keep coming to the church. Now, I think that brings me to the end of a whistle-top tour of Wentworth. And I suppose, Peter, one of the things that I was most impressed about, and particularly at Wentworth, there were people coming up talking to us while we were filming. There was a gentleman who couldn't wait to go into church for some private prayer, because every single day before lockdown hit us, he used to go into the church every morning without fail. He always signed the visit book, and we didn't know who it was until he came and told us. And he used to be the head groundskeeper for the estate at Wentworth House. And I suppose it's really impressive to see how much our churches mean to communities. And what do you think going forward the role of communities is going to play in our strategy?
Well, they're also absolutely fundamental, but they've always been fundamental to the parish church, the historic parish church. As I've said many times, these are the most democratic of historic buildings, because they are for everybody, regardless of what you believe, where you come from. And I think the problem with, in a sense, is sometimes a religion is quite divisive, and people ascribe that to it. But these buildings are so much more. Religion's obviously an important part of it, but actually they tell a history of a place like no other building. And there's no reason why that should stop either. These buildings have continually evolved over time, and that's why they're so precious. I mean, I think it's the most precious collection of cultural buildings the country has, just for that democratic expression of everybody that's in those buildings. And so why would we let them become irrelevant into the future? They need to be there. They need to be looked after and cared for by the very communities that they tell a story of. And that's why we encourage people to go out and use and love their historic places of worship for whatever they can find a reason to do: music, theatre, beer festivals, gin festivals. The occasional act of Christian worship sometimes goes down well as well, I hear. But there's all of these things that can get these buildings, get people in them, because they do tell a story of people, as well as architectural history and local, national and international history too.
I think, again, Peter, I think you're absolutely right on that. And picking up from what I've heard from communities and from volunteers at our church, they just cannot wait to get back to our churches and get using them again. Do you have anything we can announce, sort of what are our plans, as it were, for when do you think people will be able to start using our churches again?
Well, I think we can slowly start being opened up for local use. We haven't really closed our churches, to be perfectly honest with you. There wasn't a strict closure because we felt we could keep them open for what we described as individual prayer or reflection, which meant that people could travel locally. But we're slowly opening them up in line with the guidance, and certainly by June we'll be able to, we hope, if the roadmap continues, we'll be able to continue to open them up to everybody from all over the place as the restrictions on travel and where you can go can happen. But we're really excited because the world is opening up and we can go and do more things than we could before. Visiting churches, I'm sure this audience will be very happy to be out there church crawling again soon, because there's so much to see and there must be such a lot of pent-up demand. So don't forget to sign the visitors books, and don't forget you can always donate when you're there as well, which is always helpful. So
thanks, Peter. I suppose that brings us to the time of our allotted time for Church of the Week. So I hope that's given you, everyone, a flavour of what we've been up to this week. I'm going to be visiting some more churches next week, so do keep your eye on our Facebook page because we'll do some more live streams whilst we're there. But a warm welcome again, everyone, to today's lunchtime lecture. If you were joining us for the very first time, especially a very warm welcome to you. Please do comment away. Let us know where you're watching, joining us from. And also, everyone, do comment away and let us know what church you were most looking forward to going out and visiting once restrictions allow you to do so. Now, if you are joining us for the first time, these lectures are always free of charge. We don't ask any payment for you to access them. So if you see anyone commenting with any links, please don't click them. Our lectures are always 100% free of charge to watch and enjoy. We make recordings of them. Those are also available freely. You can watch those on our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. And later on, I'll post some links to where you can access those previous recordings. Now, if you do enjoy these lectures, there's a couple of ways you can support us. Now, you can firstly make sure you like and follow our Facebook page. If you follow our Facebook page, you'll also get automatic notifications from Facebook whenever we go live with these lectures or live at one of our churches on a live stream. We've got a video that explains how that works. So if you'd like to know how to do that, just send us a direct message and we can help you out there. You can also donate. As I said, these lectures are always free of charge, and it's great that all of our lecturers have given their time freely as a way of supporting us. So if you do enjoy these lectures, please do consider making a donation. So you can do that in a couple of ways. You can do it by texting the letters CCT to 70331, and that will give us a gift of £3. You can also donate through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk. Or finally, you can take advantage, like many others have done over the last few months, of our membership offer. So we launched a few weeks ago a brand new offer. Whereas if you join us by direct debit from just £3.50 a month and use the lecture code lecture, and use that in capitals, you will get sent a free copy of this fantastic, fantastic book. And this is The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals, Decoding the Sacred Symbolism of Christianity's Holy Buildings. Now, this was written by Dr. Richard Semp, who did a lecture for us a few weeks ago. He's also kindly agreed to come back. He's going to be doing some more for us in the future. But this is a great, great book for those people who may not be up to au fait with a lot of symbols in churches. It talks about saints, it talks about rood screens, art. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. So if you join us by direct debit, as I said, from just £3.50, you will get a free copy of this post to you. Now, we've had so many people join, which has been great. We've commissioned a brand new print run of this book. So you will be receiving this free book in August. They're being printed at the moment. We're meant to be receiving them in July. So we're saying early August, you should receive it. But in the meantime, you'll get your Pinnacle magazine and a really, really wonderful members book. If you've already received your member pack, do let us know what you think of it. Do let us know what you think of the latest Pinnacle magazine also. Finally, before I pass you on to Peter, who's going to introduce today's lecturer, we have, last week we had Professor Nigel Saul talk about Decorating Glory. He had a brand new book. This is it. We've almost sold out, so we've got less than 10 copies left in stock. So if you would like to get it, this is your last chance to get a copy from us. It's £10 plus postage and packaging, and we'll post a link in the chat. Now, if you've got any questions, any problems throughout the lecture, please just comment away, ask any questions, or send us a direct message, and we'll be able to help. But thank you everyone for joining us today, and over to you, Peter.
Thank you, George, and it's very good. Oh, as you see, I've got a hole in my jumper there. Sorry, I'm sure you're not here to look at holes in my jumper. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you all today, and please do consider joining us. Here's the magazine that you get as a member. It's full of all sorts of really interesting stuff about the work of the Church's Conservation Trust and things that we find out, and all the contributions from our local communities, and you get that 3 times a year as well, which is great. And please do take advantage of it, because we want you to join us, because we're on a mission to save these fantastic buildings for future generations, and we can't do that without your help. So thank you again, and thanks for attending. It's great to have so many of you here today, and I can see that you're all here from all over the world, which is good to see, as per usual. So I'm really pleased to introduce you to Nathalie Cohen today, who worked at the Museum of London Archaeological Service, which is now called MOLA, for over 15 years as an archivist for the unit and as a field archaeologist on excavations. So she kept warm in the library in the winter, I assume, and was out on getting cold in trenches in the summer, but also a specialist in community engagement, inter-tidal zone archaeology and built heritage on sites across Greater London, Kent, Buckinghamshire, Somerset, Devon and Surrey. So lots of places, and she led the Thames Discovery Programme, which was about community archaeology on the London's foreshore for 10 years. Completed an MA in Maritime Archaeology at the UCL in 2007, and she's also a cathedral archaeologist at Southwark Cathedral, which she's been doing since 2016. But now she currently works also at the National Trust as a regional archaeologist for properties in London, Kent and East Sussex. And it's an important year for Nathalie this year. And actually, I suppose I had to reflect on my own career, because it's 30 years that she's been in the archaeological business this year. And you're lucky, because I think that basically she's going to talk to you as a retrospective about her career, introducing all the interesting things she's been doing, all the methods and techniques that she's employed during that long experience. Because archaeology, like building conservation, like church building conservation in particular, is a long game, and it takes a while to build up these skills and knowledge in particular, and what you see and how you interpret it is all really, really, really important. As always, I'm extremely grateful to you, Nathalie. Thank you for doing this, because all our speakers give their time for free to support the work of the Church's Conservation Trust, and we certainly won't be able to put on this fantastic range of speakers and lectures without your help. So thank you very much for your contribution, and over to you. Thank you, Nathalie.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay at your end? I'm going to just share my screen now. Okay. And there we go. Okay, so I wanted to start by just saying thank you to the Church's Conservation Trust for inviting me to speak today. And my subject today is, as Peter said, it's kind of turned out to be a sort of retrospective of my career so far, which maybe wasn't what I started off doing, but has been a really interesting exercise in reflection for me. So I hope that people enjoy this tour through a variety of ecclesiastical buildings and other places over the last 30 years or so. So we are starting here with an image of the 12th century wall paintings in St Gabriel's Chapel at Canterbury Cathedral in the crypt. And it is at Canterbury Cathedral that we will be ending today as well. So we'll be coming full circle back to that today. Now, on the way, I wanted to kind of look at sort of various different aspects of working in archaeology. So aspects around training and research, working out on site, both on excavations and standing building projects, working in commercial archaeology or developer-led archaeology, community archaeology, so working with volunteers and members of the public, and finally to look at consultancy, which is largely what my career revolves around today in my present roles. So we're starting with this early 17th century view of the City of London from Southwark, and it just helps to sort of frame some of the themes that we're going to touch on today. So we're going to have a little think about parish churches, which you can see at the top of the screen there. We're going to think about bishops' residence, or in my case, archiepiscopal residences. We're going to think about castles and great houses. We are going to think about water and the Thames in particular. We're going to briefly touch on human remains. So just a warning, there will be an image showing a picture of some human excavated remains, which I will flag again as we come to it. We're going to touch briefly on sort of crossings and bridge chapels, and we're going to look at the archaeology of priories and monastic sites. Now, I appreciate that's quite a lot to fit in the next 35 to 45 minutes, but I'm going to give it my best shot, and there will be a lot of pictures, and it will go quite fast through those. So I hope that you enjoy. So as I said, this lecture sort of turned into a kind of retrospective for me, and I wanted to look back on how I'd learned the different things that I learned. And so this took me all the way back to Wiltshire in the early 1990s and working as a student volunteer on a project called the Compton Bassett Area Research Project. I worked as part of the Standing Buildings group for that project, and we learned a lot about recording and drawing archaeological built heritage. So we worked at two churches, churches of Yatesbury and Avebury, and what we're looking at here is elevation drawings produced by the team on those sites. Just a picture here of Dr. Sarah Semple, now Professor Sarah Semple of Durham University, showing some of the techniques that we used, and you can see the slightly sort of Heath Robinson-esque propping of our planning frame. So we were recording using planning frames, working from a baseline, and moving along the elevations to record in detail the fabric of those buildings. It also involves some rather exciting scaffolding, which sadly I don't seem to have a photo of, but we will return to scaffolding and conditions on site later on. So from Wiltshire, many of the team who worked on those projects in Wiltshire also worked in London for the London Buildings Survey. Here you can see again Sarah Semple demonstrating the use of a hoover. So you may be surprised to learn that an excellent tool in the buildings archaeologist's arsenal is a hoover, used to obviously just clean the walls so that you can see what's going on. And Sarah here is in the one of the transept chapels in the crypt of St Bride's Church in London. So again, we worked very similar to what we were doing in Wiltshire. We were recording the built heritage, recording the fabric in detail. And on the right-hand side, you can see my only experience as an archaeological cover girl on the cover of London Archaeologist in 1993, demonstrating another essential skill for buildings archaeologists and all archaeologists, which is pointing at things. Very important to be able to point effectively at features of interest. And that is the Church of St Vedast on Foster Lane in London. Now, the work at St Bride's was part of a larger project reassessing the archaeological excavations undertaken during the post-war period by Professor Grimes in London, and essentially reassessing that archive and, where possible, re-recording fabric that Grimes may not have had time to look at, and reinterpreting that data. So here I must make mention of a very dear friend and mentor, Gustav Milne, who led the project and who was responsible for reinterpreting and reassessing things like the image that you can see on the screen here, which is the building sequence of St Bride's Parish Church on Fleet Street. So just teasing out through a more detailed look at the fabric, those different phases of development within the church. Also during 1993, I was lucky enough to be able to volunteer on a commercial archaeological site, volunteering for Oxford Archaeology at the site of St Nicholas Church in Sevenoaks in Kent, where they were excavating the burials within the church in order to create community space underneath it, which is now used as a cafe and sort of creche and children's workshop space below the church. And this was an excavation that entailed the removal of over 400 burials and the examination of fabric beneath those floor levels, dating from the 11th century origins of the church all the way through to the Victorian period. And that project was supervised by Mike Webber. So really useful experience for me as a student of excavating human remains, and the first time that I'd been able to do that. The London Buildings Project continued in its mighty role and worked next at St Bartholomew's the Great, so an Augustinian priory in London, founded in 1123 by Rahir, and here you see his tomb monument within the church. Now, we were mainly working in the surviving area of the cloisters at St Bartholomew's the Great, which, if you're a fan of Four Weddings and a Funeral, you will know is the area where Hugh Grant has his crisis of confidence prior to his marriage with Duckface. So here he is having a panic in the area where we were recording. And you can see here again a similar exercise, planning, surveying, stone by stone recording. And this site was published in 1995 in London Archaeologist by Maybelline Gormley. My own undergraduate dissertation at UCL involved looking at parish churches as well in the City of London, and just part of that was to assess what I would now refer to, I suppose, as the heritage resource or the heritage asset. So looking at the number of surviving churches that still remain in that urban landscape. So there were over 120 parish churches in the City of London in the medieval period, of which only around 40 or so survive. And then looking at phases of destruction of those churches, either during the Great Fire of 1666 or after that, and looking at the percentages which had been investigated archaeologically or not. And there is still an enormous amount of potential in London city churches for future research. My dissertation looked at 10 parish churches in the City of London, looking at both published records and unpublished archive documents held by the Museum of London. So really fascinating to be able to look at sort of early church recording at places like St Dionis Back Church and St Michael Basishore. On the left, you see an image from All Hallows Barking, so possibly a minster church of the late Saxon period. And the plan above is from All Hallows Grace Church Street, which was demolished somewhat surprisingly on the eve of World War II. So many churches were obviously damaged or destroyed during World War II. All Hallows Grace Church Street was actually demolished just prior. These images here are from the excavations at St Michael Basishore and were created by members of the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society during site visits in 1900. And you can see again two key features in the arsenal of the buildings archaeologist, which is the drawn record and the photographic record, and also an enormous number of health and safety violations in the image on the right. The other churches incorporated in my study were, as the list you can see on the side, and those which were excavated during the post-World War II period by the Guildhall Museum, so by Ivan Hume on the left of our image there, and by Eve Rutter, who's in the central picture there, and also by Peter Marsden. So as an example of a published document, here is Peter Marsden's plan of the Church of St Michael Basishore, which was re-excavated during the 1960s and published in Lammas Transactions. 1994, I was looking for a job, and I got a job. I was working as a receptionist at the Institute of Archaeology and as their undergraduate admissions tutor, but I managed to do some traveling during 1994 to 95. So I worked on an excavation at St Vitus Cathedral in Prague, where we were digging in advance of, I believe they were installing lights around the building. So here you can see some of the earlier church foundations. There were disarticulated human remains, and at the front of the picture there you can see dear friend again, Dr. Stuart Brooks, who was working on the site with us. 1995, I also worked in Israel. We worked at the Church of the Redeemer in Jerusalem, undertaking standing building recording on behalf of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem. Sadly, I couldn't find a picture of our work there, but I did find this one, which was the other site we worked on, which was an Ottoman fort at Solomon's Pools in Bethlehem. And again, it was a fascinating site to work on. So you can see Dr. Mahmoud Hawari, who is the site director at this particular location surveying. You can see our baseline is lovely and straight there, but the sheep are slightly getting in the way of the bottom of the elevation there. After that, I had a brief period working for a project called the Monuments at Risk Survey, which looked at sites in Leicestershire, Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire, which it did include some churches, but I haven't decided to include those today, as I've already got quite enough pictures in this PowerPoint. The next job I held was at the Museum of London, working as a research assistant, continuing working with Gustav Milne and also with John Shepherd on a reassessment of Professor Grimes's archive and the work of the Roman Medieval London Excavation Council. Professor Grimes and Audrey Williams are probably most famous for the excavations of the Temple of Mithras, which has been recently, of course, in the news again as part of the Bloomberg project. But they also excavated across the City of London, including works at a number of parish churches and priory sites, which you can see listed there. We went on to publish a book about the council's work in the Cripplegate area, so in the northwestern corner of the walled City of London. And part of my research on that was to look at the Church of St Albans, which you can see the phase plan for on the side there. So very much learning from Gustav's models there. Gustav again received an invitation from the Fabric Advisory Committee at Southwark Cathedral in 1996 to undertake a student project at the cathedral to look at recording the ledger stones and wall monuments in the cathedral's eastern arm as part of a condition survey. So we worked, myself, Gustav and Mike Webber again worked with a student team from University College London to create records of the outline plan of the spaces, the ledger slabs themselves, the details on the ledger slabs, so how legible were they, what condition were they in, were they family monuments and so on, and also looked, as I said, at the chest tombs and the wall monuments to create a catalogue of the surviving sort of funerary infrastructure in the cathedral. Here's a plan of the retro choir. So this is the eastern end of Southwark Cathedral. And I think you can see the sort of, the density of slabs in that area, many of which have been relayed in that space during sort of later relocations and translations of floor surfacing. As is the way with archaeologists, once you start working somewhere, you find lots of other interesting things that you could do and lots of other places that you can erect scaffolding and ladder combos. So here you can see at the top of the ladder, Dr. Simon Roffey, now at the University of Winchester, who undertook his dissertation looking at the fabric, the upstanding fabric of St Mary Overy Priory, as it was known. So here we're recording the 12th century fabric on the northern side of the cathedral, which had not previously been recorded. We worked with Professor John Hines to undertake a study of the tomb of John Gower, who is a contemporary of Geoffrey Chaucer, and also working with Barney Sloane on their survey of medieval cemeteries and the Black Death, looking at some of the disarticulated sort of fragments of medieval stone, ex situ stonework held in the cathedral. We moved upstairs to work in the Triforium area, which presented its own challenges. I hope you can just see the archaeologist here at the back of this particular area of the Triforium. We again employed our trusted and tried measures of hoovering and cleaning the walls. So here you can see Alex Langlands working hard on the northern elevation of the Triforium, and Dominique and Sylvina here working to survey from the baseline. So another example of stone by stone recording. And I think we should all, that team, be justifiably proud of the fantastic record that was produced as part of that work, which really helped us to understand the development sequences in that eastern arm of the cathedral. And here you see those elevations hand drawn by the students of UCL at the top, the context information in the middle, and then the suggested phasing of that masonry at the bottom. So it's drawn by Sophie Lamb for publication. And feeding in, obviously, to the sort of wider understanding of the development phases of Southwark Cathedral. So here you see Kelly Chris, the cathedral architect's plan. Student projects also included projects on the ex situ moulded stone and the wooden roof bosses undertaken by Rachel Foster. 1996 was also my first introduction to the archaeology of the Thames foreshore, and in a lovely link with my earlier work on the Guildhall Museum archives, this is one of the first, if not the first, sort of plans of the Thames foreshore in central London, which, if you have not come across it before, is essentially, when the tide goes out, an enormous archaeological site. And this plan was drawn by Ivan Noel Hume. You can see the date at the top in 1949. Now, there aren't very many dragons or pirate ships down on the foreshore, but you can see the sort of enormous range of artifacts and structures that Noel Hume has recorded there, including the River of Moving Mud, which is the dock entrance for St Mary Overy. Right in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see just the western edge of Southwark Cathedral. So a fascinating snapshot of the Thames foreshore. And I went on to work in those very muddy environs for the next few years, working on the project led by Mike Webber and working again with Gustav Milne, which of course included a consideration of the sort of wider landscape beyond the intertidal zone, and included looking at some of the riverside parish churches, and also learning a little bit about some of the possibly more unusual traditions that relating to church activity. So here you can see this is a Rogation Day ceremony, so a beating of the bounds. Now, some of the parish boundaries in central London obviously run straight the way through the middle of the Thames, so that the tradition is to upend a schoolboy from a boat in the middle of the river, and then they beat the bounds, which looks inordinately dangerous, but also looks like quite a lot of fun, to be fair. In 1998, I got a job, as Peter said, as the archivist for MOLAS, as was Museum of London Archaeology Service, and I was really lucky in that I was able to sort of work out on site occasionally, work out on the foreshore, on excavations, on standing buildings projects. And one of the evaluations I worked on was supervised by Chris Thomas in Charterhouse Square. So just as a warning, here is the image of human remains. It was a relatively small intervention, but what we did find was a child's burial, so possibly a 14th century Black Death victim, and it has been published in this monograph that you see to the left by Museum of London Archaeology. The first ever watching brief I did on my own was on a cemetery site in Brentford in West London. It was a dissenters burial ground which was being cleared in advance of development, so a small cemetery with around 25 inhumations. A number of them had coffin plates, and there was also a very good documentary references to the site and previous surveys by the sort of local history society of the gravestones that still survived on the site. So we were able to do quite a lot of sort of research and understanding of those family groups and individuals who'd been buried on this site. An unexpected find was this, which was found in the backfill, which was actually the sign for the site. So definitely proved that we were digging burial ground for Protestant dissenters, as it's right there on the sign. So this is a drawn on site and has been retained by the church. In 2000, I worked very briefly on a site at Chelsea, where they were excavating the remains of part of the burial ground for Chelsea Old Church. I wasn't allowed to dig the burials because I was pregnant and there was a risk of TB, but I was allowed to dig some of the garden deposits just to one side. And then in 2005, I got a job as one of the built heritage specialists working for MOLA. And one of the best things about working in commercial archaeology is the variety of sites that you work on. As a built heritage specialist, I worked on all kinds of different sites, including sort of early 20th century milk factories, World War II memorial sites, department stores, apartment blocks, all sorts of, an enormous range of different buildings. One of them was an assessment of St Mary's, Guildford, in Surrey, which you can see on the right here. This is an image from the V&A of wall paintings dating to around 1200, which were recorded there, 100 years or so ago, only fragments of which now survive. Another ecclesiastical site as part of my work for MOLA as a built heritage person was working at Tor Abbey in Devon, where again we were reassessing an archive, looking at records that had been created by others, re-evaluating, looking at the surviving built heritage, and the company also went on to undertake additional excavation works as part of a wider interpretation project. Again, this was led by Chris Thomas. So in 2006, 2007, I went back to school and went to do a master's supported by bursary from English Heritage at University College London, the Institute of Archaeology, a master's in Maritime Archaeology. And for my dissertation for that, I decided to look at Romney Marsh and the churches of Romney Marsh as a part of the sort of maritime cultural landscape. So to look at how those churches sort of fitted in that landscape. I was obviously extremely lucky because in Kent, there's been a huge amount of work done on Kent churches, and the plan that we're looking at here is from Tim Tatton Brown's publication, and it contains a huge amount of detail about the phasing and the sort of development of the different churches of the Romney Marsh. I was also extremely lucky in 2007. By this stage, I had a research assistant. So here is Maisie, who came with me on many of my expeditions to the Romney Marsh. For those of you who haven't visited Romney Marsh in Kent, it's a fascinating landscape. A reclaimed wetland, the influence of the church, Christchurch Priory as one of those churches in reclaiming that landscape in embankment, in land reclamation, in sort of creating an environment in which churches can be established and settlements can be established and revenue can be generated. It is an extraordinary place. Also in terms of the sort of changing coastal littoral and the sort of climate change and environmental changes that have taken place over thousands and thousands of years. I have no time to talk about any of these churches in detail, but essentially it was a wonderful project to undertake. I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to visit these marshland churches, both those still in use and those ruined, and some that may only be the sites of. I looked at the building materials of those churches. So similar to the City of London churches, there is no naturally occurring building stone on the marsh, as there isn't in the City of London either. So all the building material to make these churches has to come from somewhere else. And this is a study that had been undertaken in the early years of the 2000s, looking at where the building material is coming from. I had the opportunity to look at place name and charter evidence. So again, to try and understand that development sequence of the inning of the marshes and how those sort of landscapes have developed over time. I did a lot of thinking about the role of the church within that and the importance of those buildings in that landscape and how those communities might have perceived them. And that move from a marshland area, which might have been seen as pretty unwelcoming and pretty maybe scary and superstitious, to an area that is a sort of settled landscape. So the image on the left is an image of St Guthlac going to his swampy site in Crowland. So, I mean, the wonderful thing about being at university is the opportunity to be able to look at all sorts of things that you might not have the chance to look at in your sort of day-to-day life and career. So looking at all kinds of evidence from the Bayeux Tapestry. So here you can see the installation of the weather vane on the tower of Westminster Abbey. So thinking about towers was a big part of this project. How do the towers on the churches of Romney Marsh function? So here we can see St Augustine Brookland, which is a 12th century tower, which may have had an additional function. It's a separate detached bell tower, so potentially used for all kinds of different things as well as just being part of a church. And then sort of wonderful things like this, which link so closely that sort of maritime aspect with the church buildings themselves, so that the churches are functioning as not only a place to sort of actually tie up and berth a ship, but you can see from the image below, there are also the potential for them being used as navigational points within the landscape. Also briefly examined church wall paintings, and I think it was at this stage in my career that I first came across the concept of graffiti in churches, which is a current area of a huge amount of interest. So 2008 to 2018, so from here on in, it all gets a bit complicated because I was doing lots and lots of jobs at the same time. So we'll start with the Thames Discovery Programme, Community Archaeology on London's foreshore. One of the images that we used a lot for Thames Discovery was this one, which is the demolition of the church of the chapel dedicated to Thomas Becket on London Bridge. So just to sort of reiterate that point about, you know, early recording. Again, we've got a whole bunch of sort of dangerous looking ladders, which has turned out to be an obsessive theme of this lecture, but it wasn't meant to be. But thinking about fabric that we only know through record, fabric that is lost and may not appear again, fabric that may turn up on the Thames foreshore, who knows? And also this idea of devotion in the everyday landscape. So obviously the chapel to Thomas Becket would have been on the main and only crossing point in central London, so very visible within that medieval landscape. Our focus for the Thames Discovery Programme was mainly the structures that can be found on the intertidal zone, but you cannot work down there without looking at the foreshore deposits as well, which is, of course, as I'm sure you all know, is known as mudlarking. It is my continuing quest after all these years to find a pilgrim badge. I have not been lucky enough thus far to find one, but here just a couple of examples found by John Higginbotham, photographed by Nick Stevens, just to show you the kinds of artifacts that have been found on the foreshore. What we do also see on the foreshore is lots of evidence for modern religious activity taking place on the foreshore in terms of Hindu statuettes that are found relatively frequently in these watery environments. So also in 2008, I was appointed as the Cathedral Archaeologist for Southwark Cathedral. So an opportunity to really continue to get to know the building a lot better from its Roman origins as exposed during the late 1970s. The post-medieval development of the site, so the construction of the kiln that was excavated on the northern side of the cathedral by pre-construct archaeology as part of the Millennium building works, and helping to support and advise the Dean and Chapter through the Fabric Advisory Committee about sort of all sorts of a huge range of different things. So similar to working in commercial archaeology, archaeological consultancy prompts you to learn more about things that you might not have come across before, or issues that you might not have come across before. So a lot of the work at Southwark Cathedral did revolve around human remains and helping to work out how to appropriately deal with them. This is actually from a neighbouring site, but the remains ended up being buried by the cathedral. They are from just underneath London Bridge. I'm not sure that the builders really did refuse to work down there, but it made for a good story for the London Bridge experience. Also advising and helping to support smaller interventions like this one, which is on the stairs leading down from London Bridge Station. The brickwork you can see there at the bottom is part of the 18th century buildings. They were called the hovels, I believe, that existed to one side of the cathedral prior to the redevelopment of London Bridge. And again, graffiti at this site, working with the education department at Southwark Cathedral, we did some training and outreach events looking at some of the sort of weird and wonderful examples of graffiti surviving at the cathedral. So I currently work for the National Trust and have done so since 2011. This is my nearest site. This is Scotney Castle in Kent, and this is also my office. Sadly, not in that building, but that is my hub office. Now, obviously, castles and manorial complexes would have had their own churches within them, and Scotney is no exception. So we know that on the island at the front of the image there there was an earlier set of buildings surviving, and the chapel may well have been in those parts of the building. We know it was established by the early 14th century, and we do have some very fragmentary remains of that building, which you can see here. Scotney was also briefly, for around a decade or so, an archbishop's residence, as Archbishop Cheechley lived there or owned it, and certainly visited it during the early 15th century. But really, for archbishops' palaces, you can't go much better than Knowle in Sevenoaks in Kent. So I'm very, very quickly going to run through the enormously large amount of work that we have done at this enormously large site. Owned by the Archbishops of Canterbury from the 15th century through to the middle of the early part of the 16th century, when it was surrendered to the Crown. This is William Wareham on the right-hand side here by Holbein. I've been hugely lucky to have spent so much time working at this amazing place and working with a huge range of specialists and academics of all kinds. So University of Southampton and Northwestern University, a project led by Professor Matthew Johnson, looking at the landscape, and also Alistair Oswald's PhD work for the University of York, looking again at Knowle in its context, and in particular here you can see Al's work on the garden and understanding the development of the walled garden. Knowle itself is an enormously complicated building. It's a huge palace with large sections still surviving from the archiepiscopal period. You can see here in this plan by Oxford Archaeology. So very, very recently, we have had a big project at Knowle, Heritage Lottery funded, inspired by Knowle, preceded by a phase of urgent building works. We have had around 3 of the 7 acres of the roof off. We have stripped the plaster from the eastern front. We've taken down the panelling and we've lifted up the floorboards. And at the bottom right, you can see the archaeology volunteer team from Knowle exploring under the floorboards. This is the survey data from MOLA, just showing the areas in which we worked during the project on the whole plan of Knowle. So again, hand drawing by Museum of London Archaeology enables us to understand the detail of the sequences of construction, and also revealed unexpected details like this early 16th century window frame, which allows a reconstruction of the eastern front of Knowle as it would have looked around the time of Archbishop Wareham, so in the early 16th century. Similarly, the exposure of the roof, this is the great kitchen roof, allows for a reconstruction again by David Sorapure of MOLA, which has led to some discussion as to whether what we now know as the kitchen was originally the Archbishop's Great Hall. Within the interior, removal of the panelling allows us to see timber-framed elements that are no longer in use, like medieval and Tudor windows and doors in the ballroom and Brown Gallery and Lady Betty's bedroom. Here is a view of the Brown Gallery in its stripped back form, and here is our building surveyor and project manager, Mr. Robin Mills, just peeking out from the side there. We also used dendrochronological dating, tree ring dating, to help us to understand those sequences of construction and the sort of Archbishop's time at Knowle. And all of this building work helps us to understand how the spaces were divided in the past. So you can see from MOLA's plan here. There are fragments surviving that give us also a clue about the decorative aspects of Knowle. So you can see these are in the private apartments. You can see a Boucher's knot on the right-hand side, and fragmentary 15th century wall paintings surviving. Beneath the 17th century fabric, which is fascinating, but I'm going to jump over, we have yet more upstanding surviving fabric in the cartoon gallery area. Pardon me. And this is particularly interesting for the discovery of ritual burn marks. So the idea of a ritual burn mark is that you're kind of inoculating your building a little bit, you're burning a bit of it so the rest of it doesn't burn down. And these were all recorded by Matthew Champion, an expert in graffiti and inscriptions, here looking particularly mysterious in the void behind the cartoon. We have medieval text inscriptions on the walls at Knowle as well. This one appears to read Tom Bourchier. So whether Archbishop Thomas Bourchier was writing his name on the walls of his own house is entirely up for conjecture. And one really fantastic output or outcome from all of this study at Knoll in particular, looking at graffiti, has been the formation of the Kent Medieval Graffiti Survey, who have now surveyed over 100 parish churches and other buildings in Kent. They're led by Alan Anstey. So the final site, and I hope I'm doing okay for time, we're just going to quickly look at Canterbury Cathedral, where I was appointed the Cathedral Archaeologist in 2016. And here you see a view from the Christchurch Gate in 2018, looking at the cathedral covered in scaffolding as part of a major project, which we'll talk about momentarily. Now, the cathedral obviously has been a very different place over the last year or so, and this photo was taken just a couple of weeks ago in a completely empty building, apart from David and myself, and of course Henry Hoover. So just to join up with some of the earlier themes of today's talk, Hoover seems to be fairly sort of omnipresent in almost all the work that I do. Even on the Thames foreshore, we have found Hoovers. Like Knoll, and I'm sure I have no need to tell you this, the Canterbury Cathedral is an enormously complex and wonderful and significant building with layer upon layer of different construction, different elements added, removed, changed over time. So I freely admit that a lot of the last 5 years has been spent learning this building and trying to understand all of the different parts of it. And I have a very long way still to go, I'm quite sure. This was one of the first things that I saw on one of my first visits during my interview, actually, to the cathedral. This is actually a collection item, but is of course also out on display, and is absolutely surrounded by graffiti all the way around it. So it's been largely ignored and has been always largely ignored. So this is, unfortunately, I don't have time, and I'm sure there are many others much more qualified to speak on graffiti than myself, but it is the case that graffiti attracts graffiti, and once someone has done it, someone else will generally go on to do it afterwards. Also, our modern sort of perception of graffiti is that it is unacceptable, which is, of course it is, I'm just going to add at this point, but in the medieval and post-medieval periods this was not necessarily the case, and we see people with wild abandon essentially writing all sorts of things on the wall. Canterbury Cathedral is absolutely no exception. There are all sorts of wonderful details. We have text inscriptions, we have the outlines of shoes and hands, we have faces like this one, we have ritual protection marks. It's an enormously rich collection. And sometimes, you know, there are really some interesting potential parallels to be drawn between the graffiti or inscriptions themselves and other media, things like wall paintings or illuminated manuscripts. It's certainly not a new field of inquiry at the cathedral. As far back as 1844, you can see that people were looking at the marks on the stone, and looking in particular at the mason's marks to help us understand more about the development of the building. And here is just one example held in the collections of the Society of Antiquaries, a survey of medieval mason's marks the whole way around the cathedral by Charles Elam of Old Dover Road. And it is an area of continuing interest, both for students and volunteers, and also for members of the public. Pilgrimage, of course, at Canterbury is a theme that we return to often. This Thames foreshore find, this is a lovely link to a whole bunch of my jobs actually, was found by Tony Thera and was identified as a Thomas Becket badge. It quite probably isn't, but I'm going to leave it to Colin Terode to tell you the story of that one and all of his research. It still has a Canterbury connection. But of course, 2020 was meant to be the year in which we commemorated Thomas Becket and the sort of themes around pilgrimage, which has been somewhat curtailed, but still carries on. Pilgrimage is a sort of constant theme while we are at the cathedral. So recent excavations in the cloister revealed this medieval tile, which shows a pilgrim. And of course, we've had some amazing work in visualization undertaken by the University of York, led by John Jenkins and a team, sort of visualizing Beckett's, the spaces that the medieval visitor would have seen. So this is the Trinity Chapel in around 1408, showing Thomas Becket's shrine in its full splendor. My current research focus is on the area just below that in the Eastern Crypt, and I will be presenting a paper on that in a couple of weeks' time at the Beckett conference. So I mentioned the Canterbury Journey, which is a £25 million conservation project, which has all of the various elements that you can see to the right there, including capital works and lots around interpretation. We're looking here at the Christchurch Gate, which is currently scaffolded due to conservation works. This is another visualization from John's team, and in the centre you can see the scaffolding there for the construction of Bell Harry. So just a sort of reminder that the cathedral is quite often, Christchurch Priory in the past is quite often a building site. That is the way with big buildings. Also just to the left you can see parts of the Archbishop's Palace complex. So the landscaping works as part of the Canterbury Journey have meant the exposure of archaeological deposits below the current paving, including this, which is the boundary wall between the Archbishop's Palace and the cathedral precincts. And also just slightly further to the north, this is excavations by the Canterbury Archaeological Trust, which have revealed, you can just see in the centre of the left-hand image, parts of the south wing of the Tudor phase of the Archbishop's Palace. So there is potentially, hopefully, more excavation to come, which may reveal parts of the medieval Archbishop's Palace at Canterbury. And Tim Tatton Brown, once again, was really the last person to look in any detail at the Archbishop's Palace in Canterbury and has published a report on that. So we have a good understanding of the various different areas, but hopefully further opportunities for excavation in the future. So I hope you have enjoyed this brief run through an archaeological career in church archaeology and other places. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That has been fantastic. And there's some really, really wonderful comments coming in. Everyone, so we're about to go into question time. So if you have any questions for Natalie, now's your time to ask them. One of the things I was particularly interested in, Natalie, was when you mentioned when you did some work at St. Bart's the Great, London. And when you referenced, I saw quite a few comments coming in about the 4 Weddings and a Funeral film, partly being filmed there. Well, the Scottish wedding in the film was actually filmed at one of our churches, and that was at St. Peter's and St. Paul's, Albury. So if you like those churches, everyone do go, because we've got a couple of churches in our care which have been the scene for some Hollywood films. So everyone, before we jump into question time, if you've enjoyed this lecture, please do consider making a donation to help us in caring for historic churches across the country. We have a growing collection. We currently have 356 historic churches in our care, but that number is now likely to increase, particularly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can donate through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk. You can send a text donation. So if you text CCT to 70331, you can give us a gift of £3, or finally, if you join us as a member from just £3.50 a month and use the offer code lecture in capitals, you will be sent a free copy of this wonderful book, Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals, Decoding Christianity's Holiest Buildings. And before we go into questions time, next week marks 512 years since the reign of King Henry VIII starting, and we've got a great lecture next week also. Dr. Emma Wells, who's done a couple of lectures for us before, is coming back to do a talk on Henry VIII and the parish churches. So yes, do join us next week for a lecture on Henry VIII and parish churches. And just remind everyone, the offer for that, it's if you join by direct debit. and that's a monthly direct debit from just £3.50 a month. But Natalie, we've had some great questions coming in already, and there's been a lot of people really enthusiastic about wanting to get involved in the archaeology. And is there a particular way that people can volunteer to get involved with a dig at all?
So in terms of community archaeology, and the projects that I've been talking about today, the Thames Discovery Programme, if you are based in London or nearby, is a wonderful way of being involved in, directly involved in archaeology. It is a community archaeology project. It is designed to encourage members of the public to become involved in the archaeology of the foreshore. And really the most wonderful thing about the archaeology of the foreshore is the enormous variety of archaeology that you are able to interact with. So everything from prehistoric land surfaces and prehistoric forests exposed on the foreshore, all the way through to World War I, World War II, modern and contemporary archaeology. So as a way of sort of getting an introduction to archaeology, it's also the most wonderful environment to work in terms of working in an urban environment. So you're outdoors, you're out on site, you're basically on the beach, and because it's tidal, you have to finish when the tide comes in. So it teaches you to work fast and to sort of learn about things and work with a team. So my top recommendation for sort of community archaeology is to join the Thames Discovery Programme as a volunteer. Another way of doing it is to look within your sort of local area for any local historical or archaeological societies that may be offering digs or other field work. Obviously, everything is a bit up in the air at the moment with COVID, but I'm sure as time goes on that those kinds of projects and field work will re-establish themselves.
And is there a particular, one question that's come in, is there a particular dig that's been the best for you and what you found the most interesting and why?
Ooh, that is a really, really tough question to answer. I think the site at Sevenoaks in Kent was a particularly fun, really great experience for me in terms of learning about working with commercial units and some quite challenging archaeology as well. I was only there for a couple of weeks, but it really does make you think when you're digging human remains. And the team that was working there was absolutely fantastic under some pretty difficult conditions as well in the winter and so on. I think that, in terms of sites, working at Canterbury Cathedral is kind of a dream because it's amazing.
No, I can absolutely see why. Is there a particular reason why you showed us a few examples where drawings were made? Is there a reason why we do drawings and not photography?
On archaeological sites, you would do all of those things. So hand drawing, I always think, is one of the best ways of recording because you really get to know the fabric that you're looking at, and that would be complemented by photography of the elevations. Hand drawing is not always possible on all sites. It does take a little bit more time. So there are increasingly more digital means of recording fabric like that. So using photogrammetry or structure from motion capture to produce a similar result, but without having actually drawn everything stone by stone. It's a real luxury of research projects and community projects that sometimes you can look at using those different techniques like hand drawing to sort of enhance your record.
Thank you, Natalie. And you showed us some really interesting pictures, and you yourself have been involved in excavations of human remains. Is there a particular way that, when on an archaeological site, have you got to approach the archaeology differently if it involves human remains?
You do, yes. So you have to have a license from the Ministry of Justice to excavate human remains, and you have to have all archaeological projects need a project design, but you have to have a specific project design for dealing with, or a specific section for dealing with human remains. You also have to have an arrangement in place for reburial. So the idea is that you should be reinterring human remains once they have been excavated. So once they've been studied and assessed, Ideally, they should be able to be reinterred according to the rites under which they were buried, if you know what those are. Obviously slightly different with prehistoric remains. But yeah, there are specialists in human remains archaeology. They're called osteoarchaeologists, and they are your first port of call if you are dealing with human remains. Obviously, if you find human remains unexpectedly, the first thing you should do is call the police.
Thanks, Natalie. And I suppose there's been a couple of questions coming in, particularly archaeology. It's very time intensive because you've got to, there's so much attention to detail you have to pay, and obviously that does involve a cost. How do you fund archaeological digs, or is it actually quite challenging?
I could talk for quite a while on this one. So developer-led archaeology, so commercial archaeology, which is how the vast majority of archaeology is undertaken in this country, is part of the planning process and is paid for by the developer. So the principle is, if there will be a development like a car park or a housing estate or a train line or whatever that is going to impact, destroy, disturb archaeological deposits or fabric or structures of any kind, it is the developer's responsibility to fund those works. So the archaeologist would be paid by the developer. There are other ways of funding archaeological works through research grants, through heritage lottery funding, through things, through private donations and things like that. It is not a discipline or a profession in which there is a lot of funding around, and all of the developer-led archaeology is generally undertaken via competitive tendering. So it's a privatized industry. It was privatized in the early 90s. So yes, there is a cost, but it is, once you've removed archaeology, it is gone. So it has to be recorded. So the principle is that as far as possible, archaeological deposits and structures should be preserved in situ. This obviously is not possible always. So if they cannot be preserved in situ, they should be preserved by record. And also it's inherent on those kind of archaeological projects, and in any kind of archaeological project, to share the results of what you have found. So disseminating the information about the results of excavations or other investigations is really important, and is also quite often part of planning conditions.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And thank you everyone for your questions today. If we haven't had time to answer them, I'll do my best to get answers to you over the coming days and next week. But as I said, thank you so much, Natalie. That's been really, really enjoyable today. And we've had so many wonderful comments. Everyone, do let us know if you've got ideas for future lectures you'd like us to try and put on and organise for you. But again, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you have a great week, and we look forward to seeing everyone at another Thursday lunchtime lecture in the future.